Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our carbon market webinar. We're happy to have you here. So my name is Jennifer Gagnon. I coordinate the Forest Landowner Education Program here at Virginia Tech, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. We wanted to offer this webinar because we've been hearing from landowners who are receiving solicitations in the mail from companies wanting to buy the carbon that is being stored in their forest. There's been a lot of activity in the carbon market arena this past year. So I think that, this type of voluntary carbon market is relatively unfamiliar to many folks in Virginia. So the intent of this first webinar is to give you some background on what carbon markets are and how they work, to provide you with some basic carbon literacy. And so we hope that this will help you think critically when you're considering selling your carbon. Now, we're not going to be going into the specifics of any of the current programs in the presentation, but if you do have specific program questions, we can attempt to answer some of those at the end of the presentation. We've got about 30 to 40 minutes of presentation, and then the last 20 or so minutes will be available for you, the participants, to ask questions. We have two speakers this morning, and I want to thank them immensely for agreeing to put this presentation together and to do this webinar on pretty short notice. So thank you very much. We appreciate that. So our first presenter is Stephenson, and he's a professor in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics at Virginia Tech, and he teaches environmental and natural resources economics. His research interests include market-based environmental policy and water resources policy, and he currently serves on a number of governmental advisory committees, including the EPA Chesapeake Bay Program's Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee and the Virginia DEQ's Eastern Virginia Groundwater Advisory Committee. Kurt has a PhD in economics from the University of Nebraska, but he is a native Virginian and he grew up in Franklin County. Our other speaker today will be John Ignosh, and he works as an extension specialist with Virginia Tech's Department of Biological Systems Engineering with Cooperative Extension, and he's based in Harrisonburg. And his work focuses on the implementation of best management practices related to energy efficiency, renewable energy, and the innovative nutrient management technologies. So at this time, I will turn it over to Kurt to start the presentation.
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. I'll share my screen and give you a little bit of a little caveats before we get started. Can everybody see that all right?
Yes, looks good.
Good. So John and I's objective today is to give you sort of an overview of the landscape in terms of what's going on in terms of carbon and carbon markets. I know that some folks on the webinar will have interest in questions about the specifics of, maybe in terms of how this might intersect with their particular operation and some of the inquiries they might be getting in terms of from people that are interested in selling carbon credits from their land. I am just as up front, I am not an expert on the forestry side. So, but we do have I think it'll be beneficial to sort of get the lay of the landscape and hear the terminology and stuff that's being used that sets you up for a better understanding of where this is all coming from. So what we'll do today is we'll just basically cover, what does it mean? What does a carbon credit mean? What does it mean to produce a carbon credit? Who's involved? And we'll also cover, well, who's paying for these things? Who are the buyers, and what does the demand look like for this product? And sort of setting expectations about what to expect, at least in the near term. Because one thing have noticed that it's complete folly for economists to do any kind of forecasting, and particularly in a market is evolving as this one is. So a little context here, just this stage setting. This graphic is from the National Academies of Science. It was a report a couple of years ago And basically, it was looking at carbon sequestration technologies and the role that it plays in mitigating climate change. And so what you see is some projections of what net carbon emissions are under business as usual and under what they would need to be if we're trying to keep climate global warming under 2 degrees Celsius. And so that red line is the trajectory over the next 100 or 80 years about what would we need to do to achieve that sort of climate goal of 2 degrees Celsius. And what you see in the brown would be, these are total emissions. This is the amount of carbon dioxide and equivalent greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide that can be released, that would be released into the atmosphere. And you can see that those are sharply decreasing over the next 80 years. But in order to achieve our goal, a goal of 22 degrees Celsius, we're also going to have to offset those emissions to get, and that's the blue, and those are from, we're going to have to take carbon out of the atmosphere, actively take carbon out of the atmosphere versus just reducing the amount that's going into the atmosphere. And that includes carbon from, obviously from trees, soil carbon storage from agricultural lands, physically removing or preventing carbon from being, or putting carbon back into the ground through a variety of mechanisms. So this is net negative emissions. And that's the motivation for what we're looking at today, is how do we get there? How do we do that, get that blue area there? And so there's just broadly, there's a lot of ways to do that. And it's going to probably require a mix of both, in terms of regulation, in terms of incentives, and in terms of carbon taxes. But what we're talking about today is a specific way to do that, and that's through carbon markets. So just sort of give everybody sort of context to where we're coming from. So what are these carbon markets? So this looks like a complicated diagram, but it's fairly simple. In the middle, you have efforts to reduce carbon through what's called a carbon offset or a carbon credit. And that's basically the carbon credit conceptually is you're reducing the amount of carbon that's either released or stored from the atmosphere. And you're getting a recognized quantifiable credit for that. Now, there's a compliance market and there's a voluntary market, and they basically describe two sets of buyers for these carbon offsets. Now, in the compliance market, you have a set of dischargers, a set of sources that are releasing carbon to the atmosphere that is under a regulatory cap to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that they're releasing, or carbon dioxide equivalents. And that's represented by that maroon circle. And so the government establishes a maximum allowable amount of carbon dioxide that could be emitted. They assign sources under that cap that they have to hold something's called an allowance in order to discharge carbon dioxide. Now, in a lot of these carbon trading programs, these compliance programs, these regulated sources have the option to buy from other sources, buy allowances that allow people to discharge carbon dioxide, or they can purchase an offset, a carbon offset from these folks in the middle. Okay, so you have this option in many of these programs of multiple ways to comply with this regulatory requirement. On the right-hand side, in the orange circle, is the voluntary market. And these are potential buyers that would want to buy a carbon credit to offset their carbon emissions, but they're doing so voluntarily. They don't have to reduce their carbon emissions. So think of somebody like a Microsoft or a Google or a Cargill. They're creating emissions through their company is creating emissions through their travel and through their operations, and they would like to voluntarily offset those carbon emissions. And so one way they can do that is to go and pay somebody else, which are people in the middle, to reduce their emissions. And but they don't have to, they're under no legal obligation to do so. So let me talk a little bit about the middle. What is involved in creating a carbon credit that you could even sell to one of these two groups of folks? So basically, a carbon credit starts with an activity that either removes carbon from the atmosphere and stores it, carbon sequestration, like for instance in forestry activities, or you reduce the amount of emissions that are being emitted. So you abate a carbon, you reduce the amount of carbon. So for instance, you no longer, if you're say a landfill and you're emitting methane, which is a carbon dioxide, a global warming gas, you reduce those emissions, that would be a reduction in the total amount of carbon dioxide being released. So, and then we'll get to it in a second, but there's many different ways to do this. It's mind-boggling, the variety of different ways. But in order to create a carbon credit, then you have to take all of those different ways that you can remove carbon, and you have to quantify, physically quantify how much carbon is either being stored into the ground or in the trees or is being reduced in terms of emissions. And so what will happen is, in these credit supplies, there will be something called protocols that will define things like how do you quantify, how do you count, and these protocols are quite extensive. They'll be hundreds of pages long and quite technical. And then there's a variety of, and then once you quantified what you've done in terms of management change, then there's a third step that requires people to check and verify that what people have said they've done, they've actually done. And what they've said they've reduced or sequestered is actually being reduced or sequestered. When that step is accomplished, then you've created a credit. And then that credit then usually is posted on a registry, which is basically, think of it like it's kind of like a bank. It's a way to keep track of credits that have been created and debits and credits that have been retired. So if I create 1,000 carbon dioxide credits and I sell 50 of them, then I have 50 left. And so who keeps track of that? That's the registry's job, to keep track. So the buying and selling keeps track through these registries. Now, there's a lot of different tasks that I've just mentioned here, and there's a lot of different parties that accomplish those tasks. Now, obviously, a landowner is going to be involved in that first step in terms of conducting some type of a management change or doing something on the landscape that would increase carbon storage or carbon sequestration. But there's a variety of folks like project developers that people might be getting calls from, and they are working with landowners to assemble and to record these types of credits, use the protocols to quantify credits, and then certify and then market the credits. There's standard organizations that do nothing but, or do primarily write protocols. And there's people that do verification. There's people that that match buyers and sellers. So there's a variety of people that are involved in creating this credit that starts with the landowner. John, we included this graph, and I want you to focus on the bottom sort of light blue squares. And this just gives you an idea of the variety of different ways that carbon credits can be created. Okay, so renewable energy, methane destruction at landfills, and wetland management, no-till farming, livestock capture, soil sequestration. You can just goes on and on and on. Sort of gives you an idea of the variety of ways in which the activities that are being used to generate carbon credits. If we focus specifically on forestry, there's three general classes in which people can generate carbon credits from forest activities. Reforestation, okay, planting trees where there are none, and growing and regrowing or afforesting or reforesting lands. Improving forest management practices, which you're increasing the capacity of forest lands to store more carbon in trees and in the soil. And the third thing would be avoided conversion. So, and if you want to think, having a visual, you think of deforestation, say for instance, in South America and in Africa, where they're cutting down large swaths of forest. The idea is you're losing carbon storage that way. And then if we can prevent that and give people credit for that, then that gives them a reward for not cutting. And so there's protocols to awarding credits for avoided conversion. So get a little bit more detail as we go through these steps on the carbon creation process. We also have carbon credits in terms of the protocols. And you'll see in the protocols, they'll have how you quantify carbon dioxide emissions or sequestration or removal. And you'll also see things like, how do you define a baseline? What is addition? They'll define additionality, things like permanence and leakage. And these are terms that are used all the time in credit generation and protocols. And let me just give you a little idea of why they're there and what they mean. So a baseline is basically you're defining a place of when do you start counting carbon, either removed or sequestered. So the baseline then forms the basis for creating a credit. So if you have a baseline of 100 and I'm generating an extra 20 tons of carbon storage, that baseline measures the 100, and the additional 220 is what you measure from as the gain. So basically the gain is the additions above baseline, above your baseline emissions. And if you want to think about it this way, you're basically having to define two states of the world, the state of the world, what the world would look like with the project and what the world would look like without the project. And the baseline is the without project condition. Now, the reason why we define baselines, and the baselines are so important, is this reason of additionality. Now, the whole reason for the carbon offset is to offset an increase that's happening somewhere else, either in the voluntary market or in the compliance market. Now, it's not an offset if you're not adding carbon storage to the system. And so the addition is called additionality. Now, this is very tricky to do in practice because if somebody was going to do something anyway, that would be that's no net gain, right? So then if you turn around and allow somebody to sell something with there's no additional stuff, then you've created a net increase in overall emissions, which is counterproductive to the whole reason of having an offset. So additionality is a real sticking point, a real tricky wicket to define in these types of systems. And so you'll see large pages devoted to, well, how do we assure that these things are additional reductions? Now, the next to last point is permanence, is a big one, because when you release carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it persists there for centuries. So when you're trying to define a carbon credit, what we need then is a permanent offset to that, basically that permanent addition to carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that's another tricky topic in terms of, well, there's hardly anything permanent in this world except for death and taxes, right? So, so how do you define permanence in these systems? And that's a big issue. And the final one is leakage. Let's say a leakage is an example of you create a reduction in one place, but that creates an increase somewhere else in carbon emissions. So, so for example, if Adam increases his carbon emissions by planting trees and he gets credit for it, we don't want that to him to turn around and harvest somewhere else. That would be a leakage, right? Or the fact that you are from a market perspective, if you prevent a lot of tree harvesting and that drives up the price of timber, which increases timber harvesting somewhere else, that's another example of leakage. Okay, so you spring a leak somewhere else while you're trying to plug a hole. And so how do you account for all of those things when you're counting credits? And this is, and all the protocols sort of wrestle with these issues. And I would add that different activities, additionality, permanence, and leakage, for those issues are harder or easier to address depending on the type of activity that you're doing. If you're doing methane capture versus if you're trying to afforestation or reforestation versus avoided conversion, the difficulty in dealing with those three issues change according to the types of activities that you're dealing with. I would also want to point out, if somebody's interested, there are multiple protocols out there. There's not just one. It says, well, how do I count how much carbon I could store if I planted my land in trees? Well, if you go to start to look for that, there's going to be multiple ways that you can do that. There's multiple protocols out there. There's a Climate Action Reserve. There's a thing called VERA. There's a variety of protocols out there. And what buyers will typically do is they will partner with a particular protocol and they'll use a particular protocol, but there's not just one, okay? So the protocols are sort of market and buyer specific, and some markets will use different protocols, and there's no standard. And who are the credit developers? These are the parties that are undertaking activities to create carbon credits. And that's the folks that are involved with landowners themselves. The numbers are quickly or rapidly proliferating, and they tend to specialize in certain activities. Some specialize in forestry, some specialize in agricultural soil sequestration. For instance, Indigo is one of the companies that is heavily in ag soil sequestration. NCX obviously is into the forestry aspect. So these are the people that are assembling and the activities there and to trying to market the credits. Let me ask you, before I get into the buyers, is anybody having a question before I keep going, just a clarifying question?
And you can either type your questions into the chat box, or you should all have a Q&A option, which is probably the best option for putting questions in. So look for little text bubbles with Q&A letters underneath it on your toolbar. Okay.
So I'll be quick here and I'll get to the buyers so we can get to the Q&A. I'm just in the interest of time, but who are these people that are buying these carbon credits? John, I'm going to explain some of the compliance market, and John can chime in on the voluntary market. But again, this is the compliance market. These are the folks that are trying to comply with the regulatory requirement. These are the folks in this maroon circle. This is in the state of Virginia. We've just joined a cap and trade system in 2020, and these are the folks you're looking at. Them are the folks that are being asked to meet the requirements. The electric power sector, and I think that is the power plant, Dominion's power plant at Chesterfield, Virginia, if I'm not mistaken. So let me just give you an example of how this works in Virginia. What we're doing in 2020, Virginia passed the Clean Economy Act, and basically is requiring electric utilities to achieve a net zero emissions by 2050, I'm sorry. And one of the ways that we're trying to that the state of Virginia is using to achieve that goal is through a cap and trade system. And so Virginia also joined something called RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a consortium of states in the Northeast and the Central East that is running a cap and trade program. It also generates revenue for the state of Virginia because they auction off these allowances, these carbon dioxide allowances, to the utilities. And the utilities have to hold an allowance in order to discharge. And where do they get the allowances? They get the allowance from government. The government sells it to them. And Virginia receives revenue. I think Virginia received $43 million from the first auction back in 2020. Whether we stay in RGGI or not is an open question. I think the new administration is saying they'd like to get out of RGGI, so we might not be in it long. So the buying and selling of allowances happens all the time in RGGI, and this is the price of allowances under RGGI over the last 13, 14 years. This is allowances are defined in terms of carbon dioxide, tons of carbon dioxide, and I think RGGI is denominated in short tons, which are English metrics. So you can see that overall the prices are relatively low. $14 a ton is pretty low in terms of these activities, but there's increasing rapidly. There's another cap and trade system in California, and the prices are a little higher there. And you can also see this sharp increase recently in carbon dioxide prices. And I think the California market's denominated in metric tons. So little less than $30 a metric ton for during the last auction in California, and it's what little $13 in the last RGGI auction. Now, it's important to understand that in these regulated markets, they set a fairly high bar on who can participate and when they can buy these carbon credits. So for instance, RGGI only allows the regulated parties, the electric utilities, to buy from a limited set of carbon credits providers. They can only buy from forestry, methane capture, and there's a few others that differ between California and RGGI. So of all of those choices that were introduced earlier, these compliance markets limit who the regulated entities can buy from. Primarily for the reasons I've alluded to earlier in terms of they want to be certain that these reductions are being achieved. And they also limit how many credits that these regulated entities like the electric power companies can buy. So on RGGI, the maximum amount of credits that they can buy is 3.3% of their total compliance obligation. So if I have to limit my carbon dioxide emissions to 100, I can only buy 3.3 carbon credits to offset that. And otherwise I have to buy it from other people inside the cap. So there's limits on how much people can go over. If you're looking at that diagram, how much they can go over to that green area and buy carbon offsets. And I would also point out that if landowners because of these restrictions, there's not a lot of activity in the carbon market on this side of the equation because of these limiting conditions that I've just mentioned. They also require, if it's from a landowner's perspective, that you're going to be asked to do more in terms of verification and in terms of permanence than you would be in a voluntary market. So for instance, if you're avoided carbon emissions, if I promise not to cut my forest, you're going to be asked to engage in a fairly long-term conservation easement. Okay, so to ensure that that timber that's currently standing is going to be standing for a long time. So again, we don't see a lot of activity here. RGGI hasn't had a single carbon credit trade. California has many, but they are relatively small to the overall total. But most of them, interestingly enough, most of them are forestry based. 80% of the credits generated and sold under the California program have been forestry based credits. And I think one project in Virginia, which is I think out in Tazewell. Yeah. Now the voluntary market, John, do you want to say anything, talk about this? But remember the voluntary market, whoops, The voluntary market is companies like Microsoft, like Cargill, who have made a commitment to say, we're going to offset our emissions. We're not required to, but we're doing this because we think it's the right thing to do. And so we're putting some money into this. This is what describes a voluntary market. So John, you want to talk about what's going on there?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kurt. And like you said, I mean, this is maybe kind of two different worlds, all under the umbrella, the broad umbrella of carbon credits, but very different worlds on the voluntary market side versus the compliance market side. The slides or the graphs on the left are from a presentation recently, about a week ago, from Bloomberg Media, kind of the Wall Street reporting folks, and they had a webinar focused on carbon credits to try to, similar to this kind of webinar, kind of give some background on what's driving some of these developments. And you look at these graphs, from 2015 to 2021, a lot of developments, and this is specific to the voluntary carbon offset retirements and the different sectors involved. Kind of the example Kurt gave earlier, there's a whole wide world of types of carbon credits, and you can see some of those towards the bottom of that second graph. Now, the top graph highlights some of the companies that Kurt kind of alluded to that are involved in these voluntary markets that make the big news proclamation about they're going to offset, all their carbon emissions by a certain date. Anyhow, this is what those look like, kind of all rolled together with progressions between 2020 and 2050 across different sectors, from you name it, oil and gas, industrials, different materials, IT. This is what's driving some of that, or is driving that on the voluntary market side. Before I turn it back over to you, Kurt, I guess in broad strokes, it's on the voluntary side, it seems like it's very fast moving, complex, a lot of different types of carbon credits. And even when we kind of drill down into some things that might be more just in the forestry sector, there's different types of these offsets are strictly CO2 focused only, but then some of the offsets might actually be CO2 focused plus some other kind of attributes that are bundled together depending on the nature of the offset and the market they're working with. For example, it might have other sustainable development goals, for example, biodiversity, other things like that aren't strictly just the carbon credit aspect of it, but sometimes it's bundled together. So keep an eye out for that. The other thing too is it's really quite a mix of actors, and the pace is expanding or increasing pretty dramatically over the past couple of years. So anything you receive in the mail, like always, due diligence, and be sure to read the fine print because it's changing pretty fast. But that's some background on it. And Kurt, I'll hand it over.
Well, you want to keep talking, John? About we've got some illustrations of some the prices that people are receiving in terms of tons of credits and.
Yeah, thank you for. If you could, let me let's go to the next slide. That one, and we'll back up to that one. So this is what some of this market looks like on the voluntary carbon side. And again, this is from this is actually from a publication, that Ecosystem Marketplace publication, that gives an example of the different types of carbon credits. You can see on the far left column there, from forestry and land use, renewable energy, all the way down to household devices, chemical processes, things like that. But you can look going to the left to right from 2019 through 2021, some of the changes in market prices, the relative volumes in terms of metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent for each of those types of carbon credits, and really see where a lot of the activity is and kind of some of the trends over those same periods. And Kurt pulled out specific to forestry. If you could back up a couple, you can see the top numbers are the aggregate across all of those carbon credits that were on the earlier table. But then in the parentheses, you can see specific to forestry and land use credits, what the volume, price per ton, and value has been from 2019 through August of this year.
And just to note, just to piggyback on what John said, you notice that the prices are two things about the prices. These are average prices. There's a tremendous amount of variability in terms of what people actually realize, depending on the type of activity, You know, so that $4.73 per metric ton of carbon now, you could have, you know, it might be much higher than that or much lower than that, depending on the type of activity, depending on the type of the broker. So there's a tremendous amount of variation there. And the second thing I want to note is that that's significantly less than what we saw in the previous graphs in the compliance markets, because the voluntary markets are, you know, like I said, they're a different animal. The level of stringency is just different. So the prices are going to reflect that. Now, because of that, I think that, you know, I would be remiss in my duties to say that you know, there are concerns in terms of, you know, whether the offsets are completely offsetting the increases in the emissions that the buyers are releasing in the atmosphere. And so, and those uncertainties differ according to forest management practices that are allowed and they differ across different types of removal activities. So, because of those additionality, leakage, and permanent issues. And so there are, you know, you'll see a fairly robust literature of people pointing out some of the limitations of the accounting. Okay, so because you sell a carbon credit doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, that there's been a net no change, and particularly in these voluntary markets. So a lot of uncertainty there in terms of what, you know, what's the benefit to the climate from these activities. So I'm at a stopping point. We're at a stopping point here, but I mean, just to sum up some key points, there's a lot of buzz out there, and it's generated because there's the amount of activity out there is increasing at an increasing rate. It's an exponential growth. But right now, there's fairly modest financial opportunities for landowners for a number of reasons. I mean, there are opportunities out there, but they're limited in the sense that carbon prices are fairly low, and there's relative to what people need to make big changes. And there are a lot of mouths to feed in the creation of those credits. That you've got the brokers, you've got the people that verify, people that assemble, the developers, the landowners. So there's a lot of mouths to feed to spread that limited amount of revenue among. But like I said, it's changing rapidly, and then there's some uncertainties about, you know, what the net gains or losses are associated with some of these offset programs, particularly on the voluntary side. So that's all I have. John, do you have anything parting shots?
No, I think you summarized it very well. So thank you. We'll see what the questions are.
All right, thank you both for that. That's great background information on carbon markets. We do have some questions. Before I get to those, I did want to make a note that I put a resource in the chat box, and I'll post it again there as well. But I put together a list of some current publications about carbon markets and the different carbon programs that are out there. And so I shared the link to that resource in the chat box. And again, I'll put that back in the chat box in just a minute. So we do have a few questions here. Oh, another clarifying point I wanted to make. Kurt, I believe you mentioned something about conservation easements and those being long-term if you're enrolling in a carbon program. I did want to just make a little point of clarification that you don't need to have a conservation easement on your property to sell your carbon credits, at least not for any of the carbon programs that I'm aware of.
Right. That was for the compliance market.
Okay.
Not for the voluntary market. And that's an example of the differences between the two, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Exactly right. That's an example of the different stringency requirements.
Yeah, so conservation easement, most of them do not limit harvest, timber harvesting activities just for regular landowners participating in it with putting conservation easement on their property.
On the voluntary side, that's right.
Correct. Okay, thanks. Okay, so we've got a few questions here. First one, do the protocols and which ones account for the major differences in carbon sequestration between old growth forests and younger forests?
Whew. Above my pay grade. I don't know the answer to that question, but anybody else have any insights?
Not on my end. I might just point to the example you gave of the variety of protocols out there, and there are probably quite a bit of variation, even on how that specific issue would be handled across those different protocols.
I do know there are some programs that do make a distinction in what practices. So some practices that they offer credits for are to improve the quality of younger forests, while others are to improve the quality of older forests. So I do think that that is accounted for, at least in some of the programs. Excuse me, but I can't say.
Well, an old growth forest, the problem, the thing on an old growth forest, which if somebody has an older growth forest, the activity that somebody would be interested in terms of credit would be avoiding cutting it down. And if you have a new growth, or if you don't have a forest, or you have a new growth forest, then the interest is adding carbon, because that's where you're going to add carbon, right? It's going to add carbon on a new growth forest where you're adding carbon into the trees. But a mature forest is probably maxed out on what it's going to do in terms of storing extra carbon.
Yeah, I would say if you venture into the old growth component, you're probably maybe becoming more of a carbon source than a carbon sink as the older trees die and start to decay.
Right.
And that might be an example of one where you could see some differences when it's strictly an offset for CO2 versus an offset for CO2 plus some other additional, if there's some sort of biodiversity element, because some of them do have kind of bundled benefits that are beyond just the CO2 that might get into certain things that are more towards old growth and things like that. So that in certain situations that might account for some differences.
And I'll just add as an added complicating factor, of course, being in Virginia, we're in a particular, growth range for trees. As farther north you go, if you go into the colder climates, they can tend to do more in the old growth range because more carbon is being stored in the soil and in the breakdown of the roots and the biota. And here, of course, we don't have that because our temperature is higher and the way the nutrient cycle is quicker. So we don't quite have that in Virginia like they do in, say, Minnesota.
That's an excellent point.
Okay, thank you all. Next question, what sort of compliance monitoring is in place to check these carbon credits?
That differs according to the activity and according to the market. There are reporting requirements that have to be fulfilled, whether that's by the landowner, usually, or by the project developer. I don't know the specifics on the forestry side. And like I said, it would depend on what type of market you're in. But there are expectations that happens.
Okay, I'm not, okay, so another question, doesn't the carbon cycle imply that there is a fixed amount of carbon on the planet?
Yes. From a mass balance perspective, that is correct. And I guess if you're trying to simplify the debate down to the simplest terms, the question is, where should it go? Should it be in the atmosphere? Should it be stored in the ground? Should it be stored in biomass? If we go back to that first graph, I think about the way when I try to explain mass balance is that it's kind of like, think of your bathtub, and your bathtub holds water, and think of water as your carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the faucet going in to the tub is the emissions into the atmosphere, and the drain coming out is what's being stored in trees and soil and biomass and under the ground, or if we artificially put it under the ground. And the question, you know, and I guess we could be drawing from the same tank if going back to the original question. There's only a fixed amount, but you know, the more that's going into that tub, and if it's faster than what's coming out of the drain, it's going to keep increasing, and that's what we have in the atmosphere. It's just increasing SO2 in the CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's fixed. It's just the accumulation in the atmosphere is what we're worried about.
So who regulates the different actors in the buying and trading of carbon offsets? Is it the state? Is it some other entity?
This is a great question. On the compliance markets, let me go back here. In this compliance market, you see that little government right there? That little government box over, right, says right over credits.
Did you share your screen again?
Oh, no, I did not. Let me do that. I can see it just fine.
Yep, good.
Can you, so you see that? Oops.
Yes.
This little box right here that says government. In a compliance market, the government sets the standards about what would count for a credit, how do you count credit. They define the protocol. The government defines the protocol, the government defines the verification, the government does the compliance checks, the government does any enforcement actions if people don't follow the rules. That's what that little arrow here means. All right. They set these requirements for credits. There is no little government over here on the voluntary market side. Right? Because it's voluntary. It's if you think about it, these are charitable donations by the buyers to try to do something good for the environment. And you know, the government doesn't regulate charitable donations. So there is no government oversight. So that's a big difference between the two markets.
And is there some other entity then that oversees these voluntary markets? Like, you know, who certifies that these markets are legitimate?
Well, there's a system. There is a system. So the protocols themselves have been vetted, right? So the protocols themselves have reviewed processes, and you know, they could be derived from government derived protocols. So for instance, international standards. So those protocols are based on accepted standards, and you know, they have people that they employ people to verify, because if they're trying to sell these credits, they're trying to increase the certainty and increase the confidence in the product that they're selling, and that would be one dimension that they're trying to do that in. So I don't want to say that they don't exist, because they do exist. It's just it's done by a different entity, and they have different incentives and motivations. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay, so what if you sign up for a program and get paid for the credits, and then there's a natural disaster such as a fire, and then your forest is destroyed? What happens to the landowner?
Well, that's a great question, and the protocols obviously, it's a question that's sort of fundamental when you're dealing with with forestry activities. They have allowances for that risk, and sometimes sometimes these risks are bundled into a sort of a what's called a buffer or credit pool, in which if I generate 100 credits, and they'll put 20 of them in the buffer pool, so you can only sell 80 to count for these types of changes. So to answer to the question, nobody comes and takes the money back, at least to my knowledge.
Yeah, and with the programs that I'm familiar with, it seems like the landowners don't get paid all the money up front. So for the shorter contracts, you get paid at the end of the contract. And so if something happens to your forest in that interim period, you just don't get any money. Other programs will pay you periodically throughout the term of your contract. So during a 10-year contract, you might get paid a certain percentage of the total upfront, and then you'll get paid at intervals throughout the remainder of your contract, with the final payout coming at the end of that contract. So I think that's another way they kind of hedge that. And I agree with Kurt that I don't know of any that go back and get the money from the landowner.
But you know, when Jennifer raises an excellent point, and I failed to bring it up, is that there's a significant amount of risk in these markets for the project developer. So, you know, a project developer might go out and work with 1,000 landowners, and they're trying to get credits that they can certify and then they can sell. But whether they can sell them and at what price that they can sell them is highly uncertain. So if you look at a lot of these registries that are out there, there's a lot of unsold credits out there, right? Or unretired credits. So, you know, and so those developers are having, those project developers are having to sort of mitigate that risk, and that sort of influences how they work with the landowner, right? And it says, well, I can't promise you all this money up front because I don't know if I'm going to get it back or when I'm going to get it back. So it's helpful to understand that, and I think that one reason you'll see developers partner with buyers in order to try to mitigate that risk. And another thing that might be done would be, you know, I might sign somebody up and I don't have any credits to sell yet, but I want them on my team, my project division. So I might pay them a small upfront payment to say, look, you will work exclusively with me. So I have the option, if you want to generate credits, that you can sell with me. So there's a lot of different contracting options out there from the landowner's perspective because of that, because of the timing and the risk associated with selling a credit.
Thank you. Another question, and I'm not familiar with this term. This person says that she's heard of junk carbon credits. Is anyone regulating this? And I have not heard of junk carbon credits. Perhaps one of you all has.
Well, obviously somebody has an opinion about them. But I do think that, you know, I don't know how that term is applied, but that if you look in the literature, because of those additionality issues and leakage issues and permanence issues, some credits are, some types of credits are viewed as much more legitimate than others, right?
Okay. Okay, so then here's another one that I'm not familiar with, but how does distributed energy fit into carbon credits?
That's a John question, sounds like to me.
Yeah, and it really varies, you know, quite a bit. You'll see if we went back up, Kurt, maybe you're driving the slides to, I think, the slide 3 or 4. We can see some of the where some of these.
That one?
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, that'll work. That'll work. Yeah, renewable energy. So this is under the voluntary carbon market, far bottom left, reduction avoidance credits, technology-based, you know, renewable energy, different types of renewable energy, you know, from solar to wind to methane, biogas, from dairy digesters, landfill gas, those kinds of things. There's a version of that lives within the voluntary world, and then versions of that live in the compliance market, depending on the details, you know, the who, what, when, where, how kind of things, whether that's a compliance opportunity or whether it's through a voluntary opportunity. One thing that kind of caught my ear last week sitting in on this Bloomberg session was they described that in 2021, so this year, some of the nature-based avoided deforestation type voluntary offsets were outpacing the renewable energy side. So a big chunk of the market had been on the renewable side, but now this avoided nature-based activities seems to be grown pretty quick. So I thought that was fairly interesting.
We used to have a distributed energy thing called burning firewood, but not as popular these days.
So here's an interesting question. Has a value been set for the value of lumber manufactured from standing timber? So I think the question is, can you get carbon credits for producing a long-term product like lumber?
I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know. I'd be curious to see how that opportunities like that might emerge, given the wide types of carbon credits that are being explored already. So no, that would be interesting. I don't have any details on that currently.
I haven't seen it. So like I said, the things that I've seen to generate credits are afforestation, changing in forest practice, and avoiding cutting. Those classes.
And I think, credits for using wood as a building product do exist, like on the building side, like the LEED market, where if you use wood to make a building, then you get certain credits if you want to qualify for LEED and say that you're a sustainable building. Adam Downing has his hand raised, so perhaps he would like to add to this discussion.
Yeah, I think these things don't go quite that close in hand. The forest certification, where you have a certified product that is third-party certified, that is theoretically could bring a higher price. We know it probably just increases access to market, not. So, I mean, I'm no expert in this by any stretch, but I don't see any reason why there would be a value increase in timber associated with this program. We're selling apples and oranges here, carbon versus timber. My 2 cents.
Thanks, Adam. So we do have another question. What are some barriers involved in aggregating smaller parcels to create more credit value? And I'm happy to speak to this, or Kurt or John can as well.
So read that one again, Jennifer.
What are some barriers involved in aggregating smaller parcels to create more credit value?
Yeah, money. I mean, it's just a contracting issue, honestly, because the amounts that are stored on the smaller parcel of land are pretty small, and you might be talking just a few tons, and you can see what the value of a few tons are. Is, you're talking low, right? $5 a ton, $8 a ton. So it is a barrier, but depending on how you can quantify, if you have a relatively inexpensive way to use through remote sensing and that type of stuff, that really makes it easier if you can reduce the cost of quantifying.
Well, one thing I'll add is, Jennifer, on your info sheet that you sent out through the chat there, that PDF, saw some resources from NC State University on some of these things. And I know one of their publications has some examples on kind of that get at this question in terms of trying to aggregate smaller projects, given the high transaction costs relative to the credit values. So that some of those resources from NC State might be interesting to take a look at. They had some examples. I'm not sure if they're North Carolina based examples, but I think they might have been from other parts of the US, but we're getting at the small parcel issue.
Yeah, a lot of these newer programs were specifically designed for smaller landowners. So some of them do go down to minimum acreage of 5 acres, depending on the volume. So I think that these programs are becoming more accessible to smaller landowners. I see a lot of the movement that we've seen in 2021 in the carbon market. Okay, well, it is 1 minute till, oh yeah, sorry.
Somebody also asked a question about, is there a standard? Did we talk about the gold standard protocol?
No, we have not.
Yeah, there was one that said, is there a gold standard protocol? And I was just typing in a response to that question, but that's a tough one to answer. It's a great question. And each protocol and each organization that runs that protocol would claim theirs is sound. And I have no basis to quibble with that. But if you're looking for ones that are the most rigorous in terms of as a standard to consider, I would always go to sort of the compliance markets, either the US or the EU, and see what theirs look like.
Well, thank you all for the presentations. Thank you all for the great questions. One of the last questions we have is the webinar going to be recorded, made available later on? And I believe, yes, we will have this recorded. Well, it is recorded, and I will post it on the Landowner Education Program's YouTube channel. And I will share that link with all of the participants who registered today. So we do have your contact information. And also, if you have any questions that did not get answered or that you think about afterwards, please send them to me and I will be happy to get those answered for you. So thank you, John. Thank you, Kurt. I appreciate your time today. And thank you, everybody who joined us for the webinar.